Welcome to the Economic Policy webinar. My name is Kevin Mumford, and I'm the Kozic Director of PURSE, the Purdue University Research Center in Economics. The center's mission is the creation and dissemination of empirical economic policy research, which basically just means that the professors that are associated with the center use data to better understand how laws, regulations, and government programs affect our lives. And we then communicate our research findings to government, business, and community leaders, as well as to the general public. And this webinar is part of that communication effort. The creation of our research center began with the belief that incentives matter and that government intervention can often have unintended consequences. But we're not a think tank with a particular policy agenda that shapes our research findings, and we don't speak with one voice. Each one of the researchers just follows the data to whatever conclusions are supported by the evidence. Sometimes the results surprise us, but we all have to be willing to learn from what the data has to teach us. I'm going to begin by introducing our speaker, Dr. Miguel Zarzosa, who joined Purdue in 2015 after earning his PhD from the University of Maryland. His research focuses on how young students develop cognitive skills like reading or math. And then he also focuses on how they develop non-cognitive skills. Those are things like persistence, self-discipline, teamwork, organizational abilities, things like that. And then he shows how both the cognitive and the non-cognitive skills influence future educational and employment outcomes. In particular, Dr. Zarzosa is an expert in how bullying in schools disrupts non-cognitive skill formation. And just to conclude this introduction, I guess, every once in a while, someone will say something kind of negative about educational policies, school policies, saying, well, these aren't as important as tax policy, Social Security reform, maybe healthcare. But my view is that the education policies are perhaps the most important to get right for the long-term health of an economy, the long-term health of a country. If you think about the national production function, about 1/3 of GDP is a result of capital investment. 2/3 of it is a result of human investment, human capital, and that's primarily our education system. Getting it right, getting education policies right are really, really important. So with that, let me turn the time. Oh, let's see. Now I can't turn the time over yet. I'm supposed to introduce some of the rules, and that is that during the Zoom webinar today, it's really only me and Professor Zarzosa who will be visible. Attendees can't share their video or mute their microphones. What you can do is you can go to the chat, and you might have to open up the chat, and then you'll be able to type questions and whatever into the chat function. And so then, in that way, we'll be able to answer questions. And the event is just scheduled for 45 minutes. Once Professor Zarzosa is done, and he won't take that full time, we'll have a lot of time at the end for question and answer going through the chat function. Okay, and with that, let me unshare my screen, and we'll turn the time over to Professor Zarzosa. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kevin, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. So let's talk about peer effects and grade retention, right? So let me start saying that peer effects are everywhere. They are the direct result of our human ultrasociality. Our brains are wired to learn from others. It's a mechanism that allowed our species to survive and thrive. We are not limited to learn from our own experience, but to enjoy the massive stock of knowledge accumulated by a multitude of experiences. So let me give you an example. In an experiment run by the researchers from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, chimpanzees and human children had to decide which one of 3 holes to insert a ball to get a reward. Via trial and error, subjects learned which one of the 3 holes yielded the reward. But then they saw 3 demonstrators of their own species being successful with a different hole. The species different the reaction. Chimpanzees continued to use the hole they had been successful for them in the past, while the human children went with the majority over their own experience. So, but beyond learning from other humans, our brain has evolved to give more value to lessons taken from those which share characteristics with us, right? That is because we acknowledge that the lessons are more pertinent as they are more likely have gone through what we will go through. That is the importance of peers, people that share experiences with us and in consequence provide great deal of information to our brain as to how to behave in context they already navigate. Thus, it is not a surprise that it is commonly observed that the behavior of individual agents is affected by that of their peers. That is particularly true for education, crime, labor markets, fertility, participation in welfare, and take-up of risky behaviors. The analysis of peer effects is in very different dimensions of life is very active field of microeconomics. A quick Google search on Google Scholar and you will find that about 2,000 hits of people writing papers about it. But we will focus on peer effects on education. So because we're particularly interested in the education context of peer effects, because the existence of peer effects creates another lever for policymakers to adjust when attempting to improve academic outcomes. If peer effects exist, then the way the group is built becomes a potential policy instrument, right? But measuring peer effects is very difficult. Economists strive to measure causal effects. For that, we need to isolate the peer effect from confounding factors that could look like part of the peer effect, but are not it. Two main issues stand out: sorting, which comes from self-selection, and reverse causality. So people sort into schools, neighborhoods, and places of work in ways that makes it difficult to disentangle the effects from actual and causal peer effects from self-selection. After sorting happens, people end up being more similar within groups than across groups. Think of school catchment areas. Families sort into neighborhoods. They tend to have similar socioeconomic status, values, and even political preferences. Thus, children in the school that serves that neighborhood will share many characteristics and will differ with children in other school that serves a different neighborhood where other kind of families choose to live. Then, even in the absence of peer effects, individuals in the same group tend to behave similarly because they have similar individual characteristics or face similar institutional environments. So let me take an example from the medical literature. A study in the New England Journal of Medicine finds that a person's chance of becoming obese is 57% greater if he or she has a friend who becomes obese. This is a huge correlation, but how much of it results from peer effects and how much results from a tendency of people to befriend people from similar socioeconomic backgrounds, similar eating and exercise habits? Actually, economists Cohen Cole and Jason Fletcher found that when they take into account self-selection into friend groups, the causal effect of having an obese peer is actually zero. A second problem is reverse causality. It arises from the fact that being peer goes both ways. That is, like if Buzz is the peer of Woody, then Woody is also the peer of Buzz. Then any effect that Buzz has on Woody will to some extent be reflected back to Buzz through the peer effect that Woody exerts on him. The cycle could go on indefinitely, and thus we will not be able to accurately measure the actual effect Buzz had on the abilities of Woody. But how do economists overcome these issues and measure causal peer effects effectively? We tackle the problem from two different angles. We rely on factors that help shape the peer groups but are outside the control of students or families. And we consider as drivers of the peer input only characteristics that cannot be easily modified in response to the social interactions. Let me explain in more detail. First, let me talk about dealing with the reverse causality issue. The key is to assess effects emanating from peer characteristics that are not subject to change. For instance, gender, race, or immigrant status. Suppose Buzz is an immigrant. He comes from the planet Sortran. He's placed in a classroom with Woody and others. We hypothesize that Buzz's immigration status will affect his new classmates' abilities. Woody's abilities improvement is the causal peer effect of the arrival of Buzz to his classroom. Importantly, Woody's abilities improvement cannot alter Buzz's immigration status. Thus, the reverse causality loop doesn't take place. Now, let me move on to dealing with the problem that arises from sorting into groups. As I mentioned, most social groups are product of self-selection, but sometimes the formation of social groups is also determined by forces outside the agent's control. Consider, for instance, a scenario with two subsequent cohorts of children. Suppose that there are 3 immigrants to arrive to the school: Duke Kaboom, Buzz, and Jessie. Duke Kaboom is older than Buzz and Jessie. Then Duke Kaboom joins the older cohort, while Jessie and Buzz join the younger cohort. Local children will have 1 or 2 immigrants as peers, depending on the cohort which they belong. Younger children will be exposed to twice as many immigrant peers as the children in the older cohort. Children and families are on average comparable between cohorts, but due to something out of their control, not a product of their choice or self-selection, those in the younger cohort will have greater contact with immigrants. Thus, comparing the 2 cohorts will give us a measure of the peer effect of more immigrants in school. In some scenarios, mostly outside the US, classrooms are randomly formed within schools, creating favorable conditions for the estimation of peer effects. That is, suppose that the cohort starting middle school has 60 children, and including Buzz, Jessie, and Bullseye, who are immigrants. And suppose that by law, there cannot be more than 20 students per classroom. Then the school administrators have to divide these 60 students into 3 classrooms, A, B, and C. One way to do it is to allocate students to classrooms according to a random lottery. That implies that the peers a given student gets in the classroom are totally random within the school, and the groupings do not respond to the preference, characteristics, or choices of parents or students. Suppose Buzz is randomly allocated to classroom A, Jessie and Bullseye to classroom B, and no immigrant is allocated to classroom C. Then economists can obtain the measure of peer effects of immigrants by comparing the scores of students in classroom A and classroom B with those in classroom C. As we have seen, estimating causal peer effects is quite difficult, and it requires finding the adequate institutional setting. Then we should not be surprised that peer effects are very context specific. What seems to be positive peer effects in one context could yield null or even negative peer effects in others. With that in mind, in what follows, I will discuss some relevant empirical evidence of peer effects in education collected in the recent years, but in particular, I will focus on peer effects in school and the consequences of social interactions with disruptive classmates. Thus, I will not go over peer effects in other educational settings like post-secondary education. But what most parents would like to know is the effect their children will be exposed to if they share a classroom with a top-performing or a low-performing student. As I discussed earlier, estimating such effects is extremely challenging due to the potential reverse causality. However, some institutional settings allow for such estimations. In particular, settings where academic tracking takes place. In those instances, children are placed in different trackings depending on their prior achievement. That way, we can compare those that barely made it above the cutoff to the high-skill track with those that barely missed the cutoff and were assigned to the less academically demanding schools. Evidence from Iceland, Romania, and China show large impacts of having high-ability peers in the classroom on later high-stakes test scores. Surprisingly, a study in Germany's strict academic tracking found that no long-term income gaps between the alumni of the 2 tracks. A child's academic achievement, especially at young ages, is closely related to the socioeconomic characteristics of their household. More educated, affluent parents tend to invest more in developing the skills of their children. This gives economists an important tool to estimate peer effects, because by considering the variation in the concentration of children that have some particular characteristic in their household, we go around the reverse causality problem and because those characteristics remain unchanged. Consider, for instance, a study in the US that uses cohort-to-cohort variation in the concentration of high school classmates with college-educated mothers. The study finds that higher concentration of peers with college-educated mothers decreases the likelihood of dropping out and increases the likelihood of college attendance. Joshua Angrist, professor of MIT, and Kevin Lang, a professor at Boston University, follow a similar strategy when they consider the effects of busing students from Boston to public schools in more affluent suburbs. They rely on variation in the percent of children that are bused across cohorts within the school. They find no effect on test scores for local students. They do find a small and short-lived negative effect on minority third graders, especially girls. In a similar way, researchers use the variation in peer composition that stems from the arrival of Hurricane Katrina evacuees into schools in Houston, Texas, and throughout Louisiana. They find no effect of Katrina evacuees on the average incumbent student on the receiving school. However, they find that the arrival of low-performing evacuees significantly reduced test scores for top-performing incumbents. But conversely, the arrival of top-performing evacuees significantly boosted test scores for top-performing incumbents. As in the Katrina and the Boston studies, a study in the arrival of large number of immigrants into Israel in the 1990s find that having immigrant peers does not affect the average incumbent student. However, the authors find that high concentration of immigrants in the classroom lead to increases in the dropout rates among native students with less educated mothers. Now, gender is another important characteristic that relates with academic achievement. Why? Well, because girls tend to have higher reading scores and fewer behavioral infractions than boys. Therefore, naturally occurring variation in the gender mix of an elementary school cohort can provide variation to measure peer effects. A study by Carolyn Hawksby, a professor at Stanford University, finds that both boys and girls' reading scores are higher when their cohort has a higher concentration of females. Surprisingly, despite that girls do not tend to score higher than boys in math, having more girls in the classroom also increase math scores of boys and by a similar proportion. Thus, girls might positively affect boys' scores by fostering better learning behaviors with less disruptions. This study is confirmed by a study that finds that having girls in one cohort raises the number of credits taken, enrollments in math and science courses, and the probability of continuing to study in the university. When they ask students about the classroom environment, they find that having a larger fraction of girls greatly reduces the classroom disruptions and violence. In fact, a study that uses seating charts in the classroom in Chinese middle schools showed that a girl who is surrounded by all girls scores higher than a girl surrounded by all boys. So recent literature suggests that peer behavior can even be more important than peer abilities. Anna Azer, a professor at Brown University, estimates the impact of having classmates with attention deficit disorder, ADD, before and after the diagnosis. She shows that before the students are diagnosed with ADD, they display greater externalizing behavior problems and worse self-control. After diagnosis, their behavior improves, but importantly, the cognitive achievement does not. Children with undiagnosed ADD, and therefore untreated ADD, generate negative peer effects in the classroom, lowering the reading and math test scores in their classmates. But once diagnosed and treated, students with ADD generate no such negative externality. Now, it's estimated that between 10 and 20% of children in the United States are exposed to domestic violence annually. Most of the 3.4 million children referred to the US Child Protective Service annually go to normal schools. Research indicates that these children suffer from a number of social emotional problems, including aggressive behavior, depression, anxiety, decreased social competence, and diminished academic performance. Thus, there is, at least theoretically, a mechanism through which domestic violence against a child could create negative spillovers on her peers. Researchers Court Carell from UC Irvine and Mark Hoekstra from Texas A&M shows that having more classmates linked to domestic violence causes a statistically significant reduction in math and reading scores, significant increases in misbehavior at school, and when they grow up by their late 20s, significant reductions in their income. Boys and children from low-income families primarily drive the negative spillovers. Using data from Stockholm, I estimate similar effects on middle school children that share classroom with peers that have abusive and neglectful parents. We go further into understanding how the negative externality spreads throughout the classroom. To do so, we exploit data on friendships. That is, we observe who's friends with whom in the classroom. We find that the effect children with abusive and neglectful parents have on their classmates depend on their location in the social network of the classroom. That is, if the negative effect they have on their friends is large, their effect on the friends of the friends is smaller, and the effect of the friends of the friends of the friends is even smaller, to the point that is not distinguishable from zero. Parentally abused and neglected peers have no effect on students that are not socially connected to them, even if they belong to the same classroom. This takes us to ask about the instances when disruptive behavior in school entails school violence, and what happens when a student is victim of attacks from his peers, like bullying, right? Bullying is very costly. It should not be considered a normal part of the typical social grouping that occurs throughout an individual's life. For instance, the fear of being bullied is associated with approximately 160,000 children missing school every day in the United States. In a recent paper joined with Sergio Ursua, a professor in the University of Maryland, I studied the determinants on medium-term consequences of being bullied. We carry out our empirical analysis using South Korean information on teenagers, which allows us to examine the extent to which cognitive and non-cognitive skills can deter the occurrence of this unwanted behavior, and how they might palliate or exacerbate its effects on several outcomes. Our results show that classroom composition helps determine the likelihood of being bullied. Having more male peers and more students that come from a violent family in the classroom, of course, increases the chances of being victimized. We find that students that start middle school with low levels of non-cognitive or social-emotional skills are more likely to be victimized in school. Regarding the effects suffered by bullying, we find that those victims that are victimized at age 15 double their incidence of sickness, double their incidence of mental health issues, almost double the likelihood of smoking, and substantially raises their stress levels caused by friendship. All of these measured by age 18. We also find that there are differential effects for bullying victimization across skill levels. So bullying increases depression and reduces the likelihood of going to college for those who start middle school with very low stocks of non-cognitive skills. But how does bullying open up those sizable gaps between victims and not victims? The answer is the school bullying hampers the development of successful adults by impeding skill accumulation. I reached that conclusion after estimating a model where I allow bullying to alter the way skill formation takes place. And I recognize that bullying needs a social arena, determined by my characteristics and my peer characteristics. I operationalize that social arena concept by introducing a measure of how rare within a given classroom the potential victim traits are. This uncommonness feature is important because psychological literature suggests that kids with uncommon characteristics are more easily regarded as weird and unlikable, which fosters peer rejection. I measure uncommonness by counting the number of classmates that lie inside a window defined around each student's characteristics. The intuition is that if your characteristics set you apart, meaning that there are few or no classmates similar to you, you may have higher chances of being bullied. My empirical analysis shows that kids who were placed in a school in which their traits were uncommon are significantly more likely to be bullied. Having an additional classmate with similar non-cognitive skills to you reduces your chances of being victimized by a 10. Interestingly, there's uncommonness in terms of income also encourages victimization. I find that bullying dramatically impedes non-cognitive skill accumulation among teenagers. The effect size is so large that if the average student ends up being victimized, she would end up in the bottom 20% on the next period's non-cognitive skill distribution. The same estimation shows there are no effects of bullying on the cognitive skill accumulation process. And these results indicate that, as expected, bullying is much more costly in the non-cognitive dimension than in the cognitive one. Although victims might skip school, their learning ability is not affected as gravely as their ability to self-regulate, overcome obstacles, see themselves positively, or relate with others. All the evidence argues in favor of the existence of a self-reinforcing mechanism, in which low-skilled kids are more likely to be bullied at their schools and face aggravated consequences of victimization. This sends them into a downward spiral, making them even more at risk of being victims of bullying in the future, right? And therefore having always more and more difficulty in acquiring the non-cognitive skills they really lack. Finally, then we move on to grade retention. In the US, about 10% of students are retained between kindergarten and 8th grade. The prevalence of grade retention implies this practice is an important role in the process of skill development. With the federal reforms initiated by the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 and the associated national rhetoric emphasizing the end to social promotion, the practice of grade retention seems to have the backing of at least some fraction of the educational policymakers. But there are several aspects that come into play when a student is retained. First, retention places older and usually low achieving students in younger peer groups, potentially unraveling all sorts of peer effects in both directions. As an example, using data from South Korea, I find that older students in the classroom are significantly more likely to be bullies than the younger peers. A study by Sandra Black, a professor at Columbia University, showed that having older classroom peers makes it more likely for teenage girls to engage in early sexual activity and hence is more likely to have a teen birth. Using data from North Carolina, researchers from Duke University found that 7th grade students who attend school with many retained peers were more likely to commit offenses and be suspended. But what about the retained children themselves? Empirical literature often finds negative impacts of retention, and despite we keep retaining students. A study using data from schools in Florida suggests that grade retention increases the likelihood of disciplinary incidents and suspensions in the short run, yet this effect dissipates over time. The short-term adverse effects are concentrated among economically disadvantaged and male students. In the same vein, a study in Chile shows evidence that repeating a grade in school increases the probability of juvenile delinquency by a third. This effect is higher for males and twice the indicated value for students with low socioeconomic status. Researchers from the University of California and Louisiana State University find that being retained in 8th grade has large long-run effects in the likelihood of being convicted of a crime by age 25. Effects are largest for violent crimes. And it is well documented on top of that kids that were retained are more likely to drop out. And besides the behavioral side of it, one of the main goals of grade retention is to give another chance to grasp academic material that students haven't mastered. A study in the US evaluates the effect of retention on academic achievement. They find that retaining students in kindergarten reduce their academic performance by 27%. They find that big initial loss of achievement diminishes over time, but they end up losing 7% by age 11, compared to what they would have learned if they had not been retained. Even if that 7% is not as big as the initial 27, think about the fact that these retained children and their families spend one more year and still are substantially behind because of grade retention itself. In a very recent working paper joined with Professor Fernando Saltiel from McGill University, I explore how the technology of cognitive and non-cognitive skills formation is affected by retention in kindergarten or first grade here in the US. We find significant losses in the production of cognitive skills among retained children and very large negative effects among those who start school with low stocks of skills. So this attests to the existence of another vicious cycle in which low-skilled children are more likely to be retained, but they are the same to face the harsher negative consequences of grade retention. Our silver lining might be that we find some evidence of retention boosting a little bit non-cognitive skill formation among low-skilled children. In particular, we find positive effects on measures of inhibitory control and attentional focusing. To conclude, peer effects and grade retention are constant features of our education system. And yet, I hope I convince you that we know very little about them. We need more high quality research, and we also need more high quality data. But I hope we can all agree that thinking about designing and implementing policies that could potentially maximize academic achievement or minimize school violence with the rearrangement of group members is a promising at the minimum, right? I hope you found this presentation interesting, and let's keep this discussion going. So I send you to Kevin again.
Miguel, that was great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I want to start off with a question. So I think you pretty convincingly said that peer effects matter. Peer effects in terms of there's gender, family situation, whether or not there's domestic violence in the home. So like as a parent, what kind of a classroom do you want to put your child in?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, I mean, that's not exactly a policy. That's more of just the question about, I'm a parent, I've got kids in elementary school.
Yeah.
What should I be looking for in terms of like giving my child the best chance?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the most important question for all the research in peer effects in education. I think that collecting from the different studies that we found is you want to have kids that come from families that also invest in skills, right? So if you are thinking, what's the best for my kid? You want families that are thinking the same thing, right? Kids that probably, and the way we measure it, given the lack of better data, we measure it by education of the parents, right? Or socioeconomic status of the parents, because there's a strong link between education and investment in early childhood and in skill development. So you would like to have similar-minded parents that are worried about their learning of the kids. But also then the key also that I want to stress is that there's some evidence that you want your kid to be among people that have similar traits, right? Because you don't want the kid to be the uncommon one, as some of my research has shown. The uncommon ones, unfortunately, are the ones that are more likely to face victimization. So in some, you need, I would suggest that you would need parents that think like you in that skills matter and want their kids to strive, but you also want to be common among that grouping.
Okay, so that's kind of from the parent point of view. The parent is looking for a community with schools where the other kids in that school, they also come from families that really value education and developing these skills. And also, it sounds like as a parent, you're trying to find an environment where your child won't stick out too much, because that encourages bullying. But that's not really a great policy position in some sense, right? I mean, telling families, let's all segregate so that we all look very homogenous. I mean, is that kind of the policy conclusion here?
No, of course not. So yeah, of course that's a big point that we need to address, is that we, of course, even in our non-cognitive skills, we learn from experiences with different people, right? So there's a trade-off that we still need to do more research on, in which we know that diversity has a huge value in learning. We know that brings open-mindedness, which is one of a big trait of psychological big five, right? Openness to new experiences is very important, because that creates curiosity, and that empowers a kid to learn, right? So and that is from observing things that you were not used to observe, like kids that are different from you. But at the same time, this research shows that some kids that are different tend to receive the unwanted attention as well. So I think there's a trade-off that it's very valid to point out that we don't know much about. What we know is that when immigrants arrive or people are bussed from location to location, they don't seem to affect greatly the average, but they seem to affect just those that lack some network, some background network, that kids that lack these supporting families that could lift them in case they fall back.
We have a large number of attendees here, and several have asked questions. Maybe I'll just start with, one of the questions was specifically talking about how do we help, what's a policy that would best help these students who do stick out or who come from underprivileged backgrounds, what does the research say about the best way to be helping them in terms of what kind of a classroom to put them in terms of the peer effects?
Yeah. So it's something that due to time I wasn't able to address, but the main driver of these results on the victimization side is the stock of non-cognitive skills kids begin middle school with. Okay, so yeah, of course, some kids are gonna stand out, but if they have a huge stock of non-cognitive skills, meaning that they can persevere, they are able to relate with others, they are comfortable with them, to the extent that a kid is comfortable in their own skin, they can navigate through being uncommon. So the having that stock of non-cognitive skills, that stock of social emotional abilities to navigate difficulties, definitely overcomes the being uncommon part. And these kids that have these abilities have almost a zero probability of being victimized during middle school. So if we want a policy, we really need to invest early on in elementary school, right? And when I see my results in grade retention, we might want to invest even earlier, right? Before they get to first grade, in boosting these social emotional skills, right? Boosting this ability to overcome obstacles, perseverance, having grit, not giving up in the first moment they face difficulty, relating with others, appreciating differences. And that comes from having a support network where the kid feels comfortable, right? So in some, I think it's investing early in those skills is going to be way more important than reducing uncommonness.
Another of our attendees asks, and this may be a little bit off topic, but asks if it's these non-cognitive skills that are so important for preventing bullying and for helping a child to be able to develop the cognitive skills too. Is there a role for, what's the role for teachers? So teachers typically are trained to teach cognitive skills. Does having a really good teacher at teaching non-cognitive skills, does that inoculate kids against bullying in the future?
I definitely think so. And there's a lot of research showing that teachers that tend to address more the non-cognitive side of it end up producing, I suppose, kids that are able to navigate difficulties better, right? And maybe something that we all relate, but when we remember the teachers in elementary school, we don't remember every teacher that ever taught us anything, right? We remember the teachers that really cared about us and that made a difference on us in some way, right? So maybe it could be a small part, or maybe it actually played a big part in our lives, but we don't remember who taught us to add or subtract. We remember the person that actually encouraged us to do something that we were not comfortable doing, or that comforted us when something bad happened to us. And that is creating social emotional skills. So yeah, social emotional skills, parents have a big part to play, of course, but caring teachers who usually care a lot about their students are a big part of it as well.
I want to make sure I have time to get to a question about grade retention. We've had a couple of those, but one more on these peer effects before moving to grade retention. A panel or one of the attendees wants to ask if there's any place where they have tried sort of optimal or random balancing across classes. Yeah. That is, trying to just spread the kids out and make them as diverse as possible. And has that been tried? And what happens if that kind of a policy is in effect?
So I don't know of anything tried on kids because it's very hard to convince parents to allow to do that, right? To be experimenting on their kids. But we know of people doing that in college. So there's a paper that shows that in the Air Force Academy, they actually manipulated the companies that were built. In a company, you study with the members of the company throughout the semester. And those are going to be your peers. And the economists went in and played and engineered groupings to learn from them. And what was very interesting, and the economists came in with this function that they thought would maximize grades, would maximize learning from these cadets.
but turns out that people ended up building subgroupings within those engineered groupings. So like high ability students befriended high ability students and never spoke with the low ability students who befriended low ability students. So we need to recognize the fact that even if we, engineer classrooms, there's a lot of social interaction going on, and that's why this literature is moving towards the learning from the networks, right? Because having a friend is not the same as having a person that comes and uses the same classroom, but I never talked to, right? So it's this extra layer of complexity that we need to address, of humans being humans and selecting into the groups that they feel comfortable with.
Yeah, okay, that's super interesting. I mean, what it seems to suggest to me is that it's less about trying to optimally design the classroom, and the literature is really pointing more towards we need to help students develop non-cognitive skills.
Yeah. And that will also help the way they build the network in the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so back to grade retention now. So if I understood the findings correctly, basically grade retention increases suspensions, and it also has a long-term negative effect on academic achievement.
Yeah.
Could you go over again just how do I know that that's the causal effect? I mean, I would think that the students that are more likely to be grade retained are already those that are disadvantaged. So how do you know that you're really picking up a causal effect of grade retention and not just, residual, that was a student who needed to be grade retained?
Yeah, so in most of the students, they use this cutoff that states have due to the No Child Left Behind policy, that every kid that scores, every state has a different threshold, but so some states, like if the kid scores in the low third of the distribution of reading, they are retained, or things like that. So what the economists do is that they focus on the people that just barely made it above the threshold and the people that just barely missed the threshold. So they are very similar in many other ways. It's just that so both of them are really bad at reading, right? It's just that one just was slightly better, and that's why he was allowed to move on, while the other one was slightly worse and had to repeat the grade. And from that comparison is that many of these findings come from comparing these very similar groups. It's just that they barely miss the cutoff. Then there are other studies that are more structural to it. And they use policies that different schools have. So there are some counties and states that have policies that parents, for instance, some states require parents to accept the retention, other states don't. Like if parents say you have to promote it, they promote it. Other places have policies that the kid can be retained because of behavior, but not because of achievement, things like that. So they use these policy instruments to tease out the who stays and who goes in the most comparable way.
Okay, that's great. So we only have a minute left. So let me ask just the question of, let's say that you're a parent and you want your kid to be an athletic star, and there's a number of papers on that. I mean, grade retention is a way to increase their success in athletics, I believe.
Yeah.
Is there some sort of a trade-off here? What would you recommend to a parent who's saying, "Oh, I want my kid to make the varsity football team"?
Yeah, that's so. I think it's different from being retained. It's different from starting late, right? So because when you're being retained, you have spent some time with your friends, you created a network of friends, and then you're taken out of that network. It's very traumatic, feeling that your peers are advancing and you're not, as opposed to being the other kid on the classroom because you just started late, right? So that can have a different connotation and going forward. There's evidence that being the older, aside from retained or not, just being the older kid, you tend to score more in tests, in high stake tests later in life. Because kind of kids are more mature by the time they reach the test. But But yeah, that's that's because these kids started late, as opposed to when we have these beginning of class cutoffs. So if you were born past August, you go to 1 year, but you were born before August, you go to a different year, right? So that's where you get this variation from. There's some evidence that older students benefit from that. But again, that's different from being retained due to poor behavior or poor academic performance, because that sets a different set of forces in motion. So I would say, it could be tricky in the sense that if you could gain, according to evidence, you could gain some, you would score more on average in high stakes tests, but then you could feel that others advanced and you didn't. So that could trigger other kinds of effects. It depends. I think it would depend on case by case, right? And wait, when that happens or not.
This is important stuff. I mean, when you think about questions that parents are faced with, these are the kinds of questions that parents stay up at night thinking about.
Yeah, me being a parent, I stay up at night thinking about that.
Me too. Well, Miguel, thank you so much for this this great presentation and for spending the time to to visit with us afterwards. I'm going to put up the conclusions slide here just to say thank you to people. Thanks so much for coming to our webinar today. It was great to see so many people in attendance. For more information about PERS, you can visit us online. The website's there. You can search PERS Purdue and you'll find us, find our website. You can also email us at pers@purdue. We also just wanted to say thank you to those that donated to the center during yesterday's Purdue's Annual Day of Giving. And if you want to donate to PERS and if you haven't had the opportunity to do so, go check the website. We've got instructions of how you can do that. Thanks again for attending. This is an important part of our mission to disseminate empirical policy research. And when you attend and ask good questions and take something away from this, share that kind of research with other people too. Tell them that, not only where you found it, but also what the results are. And that really helps us achieve our mission of better informing the public, which leads to better policies. So thanks again. We're going to conclude this seminar now, and we'll be posting a video of this to the website. Miguel, thanks so much for the presentation.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for being here. Bye.
All right.